Reinhold Niebuhr said this: out of the depths of religious faith, a Christian is moved to defy the false gods of a nation. What do you do when our national interest conflicts with our moral principles? I want to talk about that today. Many of you know that I've been out training in the desert, working with people, providing religious and spiritual services to people who are, quite frankly, in a pretty tough place and space where these kinds of questions are being asked on a regular basis. Now, these questions are not asked in public, they're asked mostly in private. So I just want to give you an insight into these kinds of questions that I deal with, not only personally in my own faith struggle as a Christian, thinking about the words that in the quote that I just gave to you momentarily from a great American theologian and a very, very powerful teacher, religious teacher back many, many years ago. These are very, very profound questions. So I'm just going to talk I'm not talking from the hip, but these are thoughts that I've had for many, many years. Even studying in seminary on my doctorate degree, I've asked these questions and written papers about these questions and had dialogue, public dialogue with high-ranking officials about these questions. And so I think about them a lot, but being in this training cycle and in this situation that I find myself in now, I'm able to ask these questions from the perspective of a person who doesn't have a lot of authority, a person who has very little authority, and a person who has very little impact on how missions go. Their job primarily is just to do what they're told. And so I got a few questions that I want to bring to you, but I want to talk to you about this from, faith in unusual places. That's what I want to talk about, right? So the first thing I want to bring up that I think is important in this conversation is I'm a person that believes in Christian realism. And Christian realism basically says that we understand that we live in an imperfect world. And living in an imperfect world means that even though we have high aspirations that people will do the right thing and say the right thing and be the kind of moral leaders that we need in our country. And I'm speaking specifically from an American perspective. And the moral best interest, what's in the best interest of moving the world into a more productive and fair place for everyone. Ultimately, Dr. King said, if we don't learn how to live together as brothers and sisters, we're going to all perish together as fools. Because we had the potential to do good and to represent the best interests of all people. But we also had the potential for mass destruction. And this is what we witnessed during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here we had the power to literally destroy, and we did, a lot of lives. What is the moral question about that? How do we deal with that? That's something that you all need to know that is extremely important. And I want to say that these are the realities of conflict. These are realities of people who are in the conflict environment, that it is not a pretty place. Number one, the realities of conflict are not pretty. There are people who are living in sometimes unsanitary environments. There are people who have mental health struggles, either before they come into these environments or they discover that they have these environments, that they have these mental health and psychological struggles when they get into, find themselves in these places, right? So these are not perfect environments, right? Austere environments means that sometimes you may have good running water. Sometimes you may be drinking water that may be contaminated. And mind you, these are all circumstances that are always, with the utmost respect, the institution is trying to mitigate. These environments are testy environments. They test your patience. They test whether or not you can survive with very, very little. They test whether or not you can survive with little food sometimes, or food that's probably not the most appetizing food on the planet. Sometimes food that has been preserved, it can be preserved for well over 5 years that you are given to eat. And again, it doesn't cause any health problems, but these are some of the ideas and the realities that people in these environments deal with. And so when we see people in the military, particularly in the United States, these people are making great sacrifices. And it is important for us to understand that these sacrifices sometimes are very, very little things that people who are not in those environments take for granted. Being able to have clean clothes on a regular basis, being able to eat where you want to, be able to go where you want to. But when you're in an austere environment, a lot of those things are just not available, and you have to learn how to survive in those kinds of environments. So imagine a young kid who's joining the military and then coming into that environment and then learning for the first time how to be away from family for many, many years. Learning for the first time how do you work in a community of people that you've never met before, and you have to learn how to get along with people who may like you and people who may not like you. There are cliques that develop. There are people who have the best interests of everyone at heart in these environments. Then there are people who do not have the best interests of others in this environment. There are people who know how to just fend for themselves instead of learn how to work as a cohesive group. So imagine someone who's introverted, doesn't talk a lot, and they have to survive in that kind of environment. So part of being tested in that environment is understanding that there is a lot of ambiguity. Sometimes there's not a lot of understanding of what's right and wrong, or the concept of right and wrong is skewed a little bit. So that's the reality of being in those kind of environments. Number two, there are people there who have stories. I'm talking about stories that are baffling. You got people who came into this environment or come into service of their country who were running from their environment. They were wanting to do something better with their life, to lead the next generation of their family from a place of poverty, from a place of abuse. There are people in the armed forces who have dealt with abuse. So think about that. Think about this is what people are dealing with. There are people who were sleeping in their car, sleeping on the street, sleeping in homeless shelters. There are people who didn't have a place to lay their head before they came into the military. There are people who were, as I said before, experiencing all kinds of extenuating circumstances, all kinds of abuse, all sorts of neglect. And the only way that they could get out of it was to join the military. And sometimes some people were expecting one thing, what they saw on television, and then when they get into, the military, it's a total different environment. There are people who are coming from other countries who hadn't seen their family in 5 years, 2 years, 3 years. And all they're trying to do is take care of their family, who may be back in another country where resources are scarce. There's just not a lot to go around. And these young people, I'm talking about 18 and 19 years old, who are in these environments, and their whole goal is they're just trying to find a better way of life. And this is the opportunity that they had, and they took advantage of it. Okay, so that's something that you need to understand. In other words, there are people who have real life circumstances. There are people who have real situations, who have dire situations that they find themselves in, that they're trying to work through this situation. They're trying to work through their difficulty. There are people in this military who are there with great hearts. I mean, good people who are doing great things. They just want to do humanitarian assistance. There are people from all walks of life, from all disciplines. More important is the people. One of my friends, who was a Buddhist priestess, said to me one time, chaplains, we're in the military not to serve the military industrial complex. We're in the military to serve the men and women who are doing what they have to do to protect the national interest. There's Good Samaritans, like in the Gospels in Matthew, right? There are people who are Good Samaritans in the military who are doing good and helping many, many people. And you'll find them all throughout. So number one, you got to understand that the realities of these circumstances is not always good. And how people come in varies from person to person, an individual. And number two, there are personal stories. There are people who are joining because of their family background. There are Christians in these environments who found themselves really, really attached to their faith, and they had to negotiate some of those faith practices in order to make a living, because that's the only option that they have. And so that's important for us to understand. And so what we're talking about then is we're narrowing down, and we're talking about there are Christians in these spaces. In a large military industrial complex, you have people who are people of faith, people who understand concepts of forgiveness. How does forgiveness work in an institution of retaliation? How does love work in an institution that is built on an eye for an eye? In other words, if you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you, right? How does love work in an institution where there is ideas and concepts and behaviors that represent everything but love? How does it work when Jesus said, love your enemy? Instead, you're in an institution that kills your enemy. And the more I think about this, the more I want you to understand that there are people in these positions who know these things. They go to church. They study the Bible. There are people in these positions who can quote the Bible and know the Bible better than I do as a religious person who functions in an institutional organization. That there are people who are committed to their faith, that they're committed to Scripture, that they're committed to their spirituality. That there are people that I pray with and I support them who are Muslim, who pray. There are people who are Catholics who pray. There are people who are Buddhist. And they're trying to negotiate what I said earlier as it relates to how their faith function in an institution that is very unusual and often contradictory to their faith. How does a Christian function in that environment? How do you maintain faithfulness to Jesus, who says in Matthew chapter 5, if someone slaps you on the one side of the cheek, turn the other cheek? That's diametrically opposed to what Jesus says. These institutions are not functioning. So how do you then as a Christian function in that environment? Very, very parallel, these themes of institution versus your Christian faithfulness parallels a lot with Old Testament and New Testament. And here's how. When you look at the Old Testament, what do you see? You see war, you see fighting, you see killing, you see family conflict, you see adultery, you see jealousy, envy, everything in the Old Testament. Think about this. The underbelly of the Old Testament is conflict between human beings, nation against nation, land against land. When you look out the entire Hebrew Bible, the Christian Hebrew Bible, this is what you're going to see. And what's more powerful about that is that when you look at the gospel messages, what's the underbelly of how Jesus' ministry functioned? What is the context by which his ministry functioned? The context is the Roman government and the Roman military taking over another people. So in both instances, you see something strategically implemented in order to push one ethnic group or one geographical location over and above another. And one of the primary ways of doing that was through war and fighting. And what you see in the New Testament, you see the underbelly of war, fighting, and the institutional domination. Rome during that time was the most powerful military in the known world. And what do you see rise up out of that? Jesus. And what did Jesus say? Think about it, my friend. What did Jesus talk about whenever one person wanted to institute and use retaliation as a way to succeed in the world? So what Jesus was talking about and what Jesus represented and all throughout the Gospels, and I'm not talking about one particular text other than Matthew 5, but you can look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Probably more so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you'll see the underbelly of Jesus' ministry is over and against war-fighting institutions. So the themes of forgiveness, love, non-retaliation, peacemaking, generosity, helping the poor, helping those who are downtrodden. This is Jesus' ministry. In these kinds of institutions, there needs to be a consciousness. So think about the circumstance you're in. Are you in a situation, are you in an institution where you feel like you need to muzzle yourself or not talk about your faith or run away from your faith or not be faithful and diligent to discuss or live by your biblical principles or live by your ethical principles or live by your moral principles because the institution is telling you not to do so? Then my challenge to you is you have a calling to follow Jesus rather than the institution. That's why Jesus says, if anyone wants to come after me, if anyone wants to follow me, take up your cross. Take up your way of seeing things. Take up your way of functioning. Be in the world, but not of the world. This is what Paul talked about, right? Paul worked for an institution. He was a part of war-fighting institution, and Christ called him out of that to be something different. And so when we talk about faith in unusual places, I want you to think about, what is God calling you to do right where you are, right? If Jesus says, love your neighbor, what does that mean to you? If Jesus says, turn the other cheek, what does that mean to you? What the Spirit is saying to you is you have a calling to follow Christ rather than institution.